when we label food as good or bad, what we're doing then is attaching morality to it. No food, whether it's a cake or an apple or a salad with spinach, is really that good or going to be that bad for any individual person's health outcomes. I grew up exposed to Weight Watchers, and I think there was curves, and it's why did food suddenly become this transaction? I see it play out in adulthood because often these are the folks that need to reform and unlearn a story with food. And so a term that we use is diet trauma, and it can take years to unlearn. Something I say to my kids often is all food is good food and all bodies are good bodies.
Welcome, Nita, to the show.
Hi, Kelsey. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk with you. I was looking, I've seen your content previously before. We got connected by a mutual friend, but I felt like the more I was looking at your Instagram page and your business page and your website, the more I was like, I don't feel like I even need to put a lot of effort into pre-planning this because there were so many questions that were just coming up for me around what you do. But I would love to hear you explain, if you had to explain to a sixth grader what you do, what do you think you would say?
I was really mulling this question over. And I think the best way for me to sort of describe it to a young person would be I help people formulate or reform a relationship with food that works for them and their body and their culture and who they are.
Nice. Good, succinct way to say it. Awesome.
Yeah.
So before you were creating content for, I think you have over 100,000 parents who follow you online. What did your career look like in the beginning? Did you always know that you wanted to do your own thing, or how did that kind of progress?
Yeah, so I can give you a bit of the backstory. I knew at a really young age that I wanted to be a registered dietitian. I remember being in high school and this woman was speaking on the TV, and she was talking to and alluding to sort of this, chronic disease and diabetes sort of epidemic, if you will, amongst a very specific population in Canada, and that's the Indigenous peoples. And at the same time, my parents had always owned a grocery store in the inner city, and the vast majority of our clients were either Indigenous, newcomers, just people who have had experiences being oppressed. And so I started to make these connections when I would do my shifts, if you will, at the grocery store. And I started to participate in noticing what people were buying, what they weren't buying. And then I started making these connections about, okay, well, if someone could offer some education around food skills, how to kind of understand what foods might be beneficial for our health, could we change purchasing behavior? So that was the start. And then I decided I was going to be this dietitian, got into university, and then right away, went through year by year. And I was quite young when I finally became a registered dietitian. And then I did have a stint where I worked in my internship rurally. And by rural, I mean in Nunavut, in a population of 800 people in this little community called Repulse Bay. Took a bit of time to go to northern BC, eventually made my way back to Winnipeg. And here, a lot of the job opportunities seem to be pointed towards long-term care. And so I got linked into a couple care homes, and that started to get a little, it was a really humbling experience. I learned so much from that, but it didn't provide me with the challenge I was looking for. And having been raised in a family full of entrepreneurs, and even my sibling is an entrepreneur, I wanted to go ahead and take that leap into the private sector. And so I started becoming a private practice dietitian, where I was just really felt lucky to see one or two clients a month. That grew to once a weekend. And then literally every day there would be email requests coming in to book in with me. And then it sort of became really clear to me that I needed to, possibly leave my secure, role in clinical nutrition for this private practice. And I couldn't be, more happy to have done that. And so I officially went private fully. It was during COVID. 2021 was my last day at the nursing home. And then I was able to dedicate time to both my private practice, and then with my business partner, we operate Happy Healthy Eaters, where again, we focus a lot on infant and childhood nutrition.
So you went from kind of both ends of the spectrum. You went from helping in like nursing homes and helping people with like kind of long-term care,
Yeah.
yeah, in their elderly years, to then the opposite end of the spectrum. So what was that like? Or I guess how did you kind of make that drastic switch?
Yeah, I think the crux of that really was motherhood and being in a position where I was tied down to being there for specific hours a week at a specific time. I just felt like wasn't working for how I wanted to show up as a parent. And so then mornings would be really hectic. I'd find myself really scrambled. And I know for a lot of people, there is no other way. You know, if you are a shift worker or a nurse, or maybe you have to be in the OR room, like it's difficult. But for me, I had this sort of luxury, if you will, of saying, okay, you know what, let's step aside and see if I can give this a fair shot. And I guess, you know, I feel really fortunate that it's worked out really well for me, where I can, you know, I can be busy and I can practice my passion, but also be really the parent that I want to be.
So I'm curious, like being a dietitian for people in their senior years, what were some of the things about that work or that role that you felt like had a really big impact on you?
I think just kind of that it was like a foresight into what happens when we don't manage chronic diseases, right? And so I think for me, I hold a lot of, yeah, just curiosity about that and wanting to really work with the clients that come through my door to engage in health promoting behaviors that could possibly prevent outcomes where they, you know, are unable to live independently. And I think for most people, that is the goal, is we want to not just live long lives, but we want to live well throughout the life. So that perspective has been really, really valuable.
Mhm. Yeah. And I mean, that probably for a lot of people starts with how they fuel their bodies, but people probably overlook that part a lot.
Totally.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting. Okay, cool. So when you kind of went into your private practice, and then was it around that same time that you and your business partner started growing the account? Like what was that like when you saw that really kind of starting to take off?
Yeah, that one is a really fun and interesting story. So, my business partner, Jessica, she's also a registered dietitian. We often kept in touch. And when I had my second son, I was already doing these workshops on, you know, teaching parents how to feed their baby and how to adapt their cultural food so that they could enjoy these foods with their baby. And, you know, Jessica just kind of put a plug in my ear, like, you know, Nita, if you ever want to take that content and like put it in an evergreen course, let me know. I'm kind of interested. And she already had this account, Happy Healthy Eaters, but wasn't doing a lot with it. So I mulled it over with my 4-month old, and I had a toddler at the time. And I thought, you know what, we totally should do this. So we started to get to work. And then everything changed March 2020. Everybody knows what happened in March of 2020. But that actually worked a little bit to our benefit, because now parents were having to learn from home and public health hadn't quite caught up yet. And parents still needed to feed their baby. They couldn't go to drop in classes. They couldn't go to see their physician as regularly. So by that time, we'd already launched, we were just starting to launch the course. So that was what kind of spiraled the growth of Happy Healthy Eaters early on.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Can
So
you,
just
sorry,
like
go ahead.
I was, part of it is I was already in it, like feeding my son and sharing that on social media. And I think people who had a baby around the same time really liked following that and have kind of just hunger.
Yeah, cool. Can you remember, like, is there a time that comes to mind when you were like, oh, this is really working? Like this account is growing. People are liking this content.
Yeah, I think there's a couple moments, but we had some really great, you know, community shares that got us a lot of publicity. But also, I think something Jess and I do often is just looking at the data, and we were, you know, growing our email list and getting, you know, really good open rates and making these connections, and then eventually started getting some more brand partnerships and getting more content up on the blog. It's so fun to see how many people are coming through the website, and so those you know situations were all really eye-opening and validated, like we were doing the right work for the right reason. And now we're just trying to grow and continue to nurture that audience as well.
Yeah. I can imagine that during that time when so many people were at home and like kind of trying to find things to do with their time, I can imagine how that would have kind of almost like put gasoline on the fire. But I
Mhm.
can also imagine that some of the probably most like almost like overwhelmed and lost and seeking for answers people are probably new parents that are like, I hope I'm doing this right.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think the message we heard was that people were just like really happy that we had gotten the ball rolling at that time. I mean, we didn't manifest that. It just sort of happened. And then it was sort of like, okay, we need to get this out. Parents need this. And yeah, I mean, from there we've only really grown in terms of our offerings, but it was just such a neat story.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And you guys, you kind of got to come at it from that very authentic perspective because you were going through it. This wasn't just something that you learned online and was kind of passing on that information. You're like, I'm literally a living example of the person that I want to help.
Totally. And also, I didn't know a lot about infant nutrition because so much of my education and my practice was with adults and with seniors. So I had to dig through a lot of that research and understand it myself. So, literally, like in it with other parents. And that's something Jess and I always talk about is like the challenges that parents are experiencing just because we're dietitians doesn't mean we're immune to them. I mean, we've gone through the picky eating phases and the food throwing phases, and it is really frustrating, but there are really neat ways to navigate that where we're not doing any harm and we're supporting parents in a food parenting style that is going to work for them.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back around to that. I'm curious when you were first kind of making that transition, from working for a company into entrepreneurship, what was that transition like for you, just like on a personal level? Like, did it ever feel risky to be, going off on your own while also being a parent?
Hmm. Yeah, it did feel really, really risky. I feel really fortunate that I'm in, a healthy and happy marriage with my partner who has an income where it's very, very stable. So we often talk about how like he's the bond and I'm the equity. And so I think that was really, really helpful. And I know not everyone, is in that situation. And hats off to single moms. Like I have such a hard time wrapping my head around how all of the things get done. But that was like I think without that, it would have been a lot harder for me to have made this decision. And then, like I mentioned, I come from a family like full of entrepreneurs. I'm trying to actually think of like aunties, uncles, parents. Like, there's nobody who works for anyone. They all work for themselves. So at a really young age, I understood that this is a risk. And sometimes to, be profitable and be successful, you have to spend money. And so I think those lessons I value a lot. And I just knew I could go to my family for support as needed.
Yeah, that's huge being like surrounded by entrepreneurs. I think it's probably, well, I know firsthand it's so much harder kind of taking that leap when the people in your inner circle don't live that life because I mean, I felt that firsthand like I said, like I feel like there's a lot of people in my life, especially in the beginning, who almost kind of wanted me just out of love. They wanted me to go back to the comfort zone of employment and I was like, I need to start surrounding myself with other people who get it and who are going to just give me the encouragement I need to keep going on those days where you are kind of questioning yourself.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, you touched on this a little bit already, but I'm curious because being a dietitian, I mean, you probably could have focused on any avenue, sports nutrition, weight loss, adults. What was it, or was there a moment that you realized that the baby and toddler nutrition was what you really wanted to focus on?
I mean, I think it's just like an area of nutrition I really enjoy. And it's what I'm going through, so it just feels really natural, and it's where I'm at today, but I wouldn't be surprised if down the road, maybe I'm doing kids sport nutrition because I do have two busy boys, who are in all sorts of sports, and I'm gonna need to learn about how to properly fuel that engagement. But for me, this just felt like a really nice spot. I also just love connecting with mothers I've never had, not that I can remember, a really negative experience or interaction. And so I just really appreciate this population, and it's very, very challenging to do pediatric nutrition. I think if you talk to other clinicians who do both adult care and pediatric care, everyone agrees peds is tricky, right? You're dealing with these little kids, and sometimes a situation that may not be urgent in adult care actually is a bit more urgent with pediatrics. So I really love that. And around the same time, I started to become really passionate about the relationship that people have with food, and started to notice. And Kelsey, I've done a bit of like digging around on you too, and you kind of reformed your own relationship with food. And I also went through a few years where there was like a bit of like a sketchy, obscure relationship with food. And so, knowing that, I wanted to make sure that we can set parents up with success in supporting their child through intuitive eating, and hopefully not having to have kids that are growing up in a society where they're having to deal with diet culture and the thin ideal. And it just makes sense to start those conversations early on.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. That was actually one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, because I've thought about this a lot, being somebody who had an eating disorder for many years. Even before I have kids, I'm very conscious of how to not pass that on. And I think it does start with the relationship that we have with food. And it's something that you don't really hear a lot of people talk about until you start searching for that content. And sometimes people hear like relationship with food and they just don't get it at all. But everybody does have a relationship with food. And a lot of times we have like these kind of stories that we tell ourselves about food that we're maybe not even conscious of because we learned them from our parents or our grandparents. So I'm curious, from what you've done and your expertise, how early do you think kids start picking up on their parents' relationship with food?
I think like well into toddlerhood. I think we send signals, whether intentionally or unintentionally, by maybe questioning a toddler's request for an additional portion of food, or saying, well, you got to eat the broccoli first, then mama will give you the cake. Then what are we doing? The message we're sending is, oh, like, you have to kind of eat the broccoli in order to have cake as the reward. And do we really want children to perceive food as a reward? So I think it can start quite early. And I think some would even argue even in infancy, when we're breastfeeding or bottle feeding, and maybe our child's growth isn't going the direction that a care provider wants it to go. And so then we start to maybe overfeed or underfeed. And really there's a notion that babies are born intuitive eaters, and it's our job as caregivers to remain responsive to their hunger and fullness cues.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it starts early. And yeah, we have a lot of stats on how, young girls are already engaging in dieting type behavior, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah. I mean, I can remember like growing up as a young girl and watching. I remember this one movie specifically. Did you ever watch like the Bring It On movies, like the cheerleader movies? There was one specifically where, for whatever reason, this scene has just always been implanted in my mind, where there was one girl that was like, I think like a size 6, and there was other girls on the team saying that like she was like the fat cheerleader. And I think there was a lot of those narratives in like the 90s, early 2000s. Like diet culture was really big. I think we're more aware of it now, but I think like the TV shows that we watch, the movies we watch, kind of implant those messages in our brain that we're not even always aware of. So it goes beyond just like what your parents teach you about food. It's also like what society teaches you about how you're supposed to eat and how you're supposed to look. I know that's something I saw kind of repeatedly in your content, that you kind of reject this idea of like, using things like dessert as the reward, or even labeling some foods as like, good versus bad foods. So can you explain kind of what that means to you around like not labeling some foods as good and bad?
Hmm. So one of the things I like to talk to people about is when we label food as good or bad, what we're doing then is attaching morality to it. And the truth is no food, whether it's a cake or an apple or a salad with spinach, is really like that good or going to be that bad for any individual like person's health outcomes. And so really it's about helping people disentangle sort of this idea that morality needs to be attached to food. And when people hold on to good versus bad lists, or sometimes foods, everyday foods, what it does is it really complicates the feeding arena for them, and it adds on unnecessary food rules, when really we should have relaxed and joyful eating experiences that aren't just transactional. I grew up like exposed to Weight Watchers, and I think there was curves, and it's like, why did food suddenly become this transaction where if, I eat almonds, then I get XYZ points, but if I go for a workout, then I get to minus a few points. Like that's just really not how we evolved as humans. And so that's sort of what I'm kind of alluding to when I talk about good food versus bad food. And in case any listeners want a mantra, and of course, with any mantra, there's a bit of nuance, but something I say to my kids often is like, all food is good food and all bodies are good bodies.
Oh, that's a good one.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. All food is fuel at the end of the day.
Mhm.
I mean, this is actually something that I've struggled with my nephews, because I think they've gotten progressively pickier as they've gotten older. And this is something that I've actually like stopped and paused and kind of reflected on, like, okay, how do I want to handle this without teaching them this conception of like bad food? Because it's very often that they like don't want to eat the vegetables, or they don't want to eat the meat on their plate, but they want dessert. And
Mhm.
I've kind of had situations where I've been babysitting them or whatever, and I'm pausing and I'm like, okay, how do I teach them what I'm trying to teach them right now without passing on this narrative that they need to eat the quote good food
Mhm.
before they get the quote bad food? So what do you think, or I guess in your experience, have you tried any kind of like strategies or anything to kind of help guide kids towards more like whole foods over the more like sugary processed foods? How do you kind of navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm experiencing that too. But one of the things that we've also realized a little bit more recently is that, talking to children about food and its nutrition content is actually developmentally inappropriate until about age 10. So it's like, imagine like getting a 6-month-old to practice walking. Like nobody does that, right?
Mhm.
But, around 12 months, 14 months, like you're kind of working on this new skill. But in the meantime, parents can do a lot to foster this curiosity by just serving the foods. Parents often aren't modeling with children. There's always something now competing for family meals, whether it's like a practice, a book club, a Netflix series. And so I think just making sure that parents are having family meals and that you're taking time to model the joy in eating the vegetable, because your kids need to see that, and a child can't learn to eat a food they're not served. And then another one is actually just exploration, like getting kids in the kitchen, maybe making XYZ food with zero expectation that they're going to eat it, can be really helpful, because anytime we make a suggestion or put a bit of pressure on a child, actually what happens is the adrenaline in their body increases, and then they're not able to actually have any productive learning. We want kids ultimately to be intrinsically motivated to enjoy XYZ food, and not because it makes me or Auntie Kelsey happy, right? Because I'm just happy to be with my kids at the dining table.
Yeah, what you said there about like babies are born with this like intuitive hunger, and we maybe unintentionally kind of teach them our own like cues and rules or stories about food. It made me think of something that I learned probably sometime last year that always stuck in my head, is that babies are born with, or we're all born with two inherent fears. We have the fear of loud noises, and we have the fear of being dropped or falling. And
Mhm,
every single other fear we develop, we've been taught.
mhm,
It
mhm,
kind of it made me think, or mirrors a little bit what you said here about eating and hunger, is that we have an intuitive hunger. Like babies will realize in their body when they're hungry. But I've
You
seen,
know you know when they're hungry because they're like screaming.
yeah, but I've seen, whether it's like in my own family members or friends or just other people I've observed, that I think with the best intentions, I've seen parents get very regimented with food, and sometimes it is for their own sanity, because they're like, this is the time we have to eat, so we're eating at this time, or wanting to have their child like on a snack schedule because they're like, I want her to go to sleep at a certain time, so she needs to finish eating by a certain time. But I think it can, or I mean, I would love to get your thoughts on this. It could probably have the opposite effect where now you're teaching a child to be super regimented with when they eat, as opposed to just being intuitive and listening to their bodies.
Totally. And, that rigidity and lack of flexibility can be really tough to navigate as a parent. And that can sometimes bleed into other things too, like how the child wants to be dressed, washing hands or not having like certain textures on their hands. So I think it is really important to honor that children, for the most part, like we can trust our child, eat enough. And, we as parents do have certain responsibilities, but I think like the trust piece often gets undermined when a parent is worried about something, whether they're worried their child is not eating enough, eating too much. That's when we sometimes see these practices start to kind of sneak in.
Is that something, because I would guess that probably one of the most common reasons that people might seek you out or somebody like you to help with their child's eating is because they almost don't trust that their child has that intuitiveness, and they're constantly wondering, like, am I doing this right? Am I feeding him enough protein? Like, he's not eating what I put on his plate. It probably comes from a place of questioning, like, am I doing a good enough job? Do you find that
Totally.
that's something a lot of people kind of come to you with?
Yeah, totally. And sometimes there are more medically complex cases too, but I think for the most part, like I'm having a lot of discussions with parents around the picky eating piece and how to sort of restore this trust between the parent and child relationship. Because when there's a lot of like chi and bickering between the parent and child, like we don't want that at the dining table. Like we want our kids to hang around with us well into the teenage years at that dining table, and it has to be positive. And if the relationship is suffering, we need to take a step back and relook at things and find ways to kind of reignite joy back at the dining table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the videos that I watched of yours last night, it was something that I was like, this would be good to talk about because I've ran into this a bunch of times with my nephews where you prepare something for dinner and your kid's like, I don't want that. And I remember watching in that video, you kind of had a suggestion for how to kind of work with them through that. Could you kind of explain what
Hmm.
worked or what you've tested or what you recommend to people in that scenario?
Sure. Well, maybe we'll take a step back, because what I encourage parents to do when you are planning a meal is to make sure that you've done a good job of serving a range of foods, but having at least one or two foods that you know your kid can be successful at. So I'm of Punjabi descent. So a staple food at most meals for me is either like naan, roti, or rice, all of which are like really good heavy hitters for my kids. So if I change up the sides, that's fine, because there's going to be the roti, naan, or rice, which they can have an unlimited volume of. So if parents aren't doing a good job of being kind and considerate, then I would encourage them to do that. And then if you do run into a situation where your child like is not interested in the food, you have been kind, you've been considerate, but you're not catering, then I think you can invite your child, especially if they have some language skills, and say like, well, what could I do to make this better for you? And your
Mhm.
kid might come up with the most like obscure combination, like they want peanut butter with their carrots, or they want a bit of maple syrup with XYZ food. And so you can help them kind of problem solve through that. And then the other part of it is, if nothing is really working, kind of understanding that this is just one meal. And so maybe your child that day actually got what they needed throughout the day at breakfast, snack, and lunch, or maybe they're just not feeling it like we do as adults. And so just setting the boundary, like this is what mama made for dinner, and you don't have to eat it, but I do want you to hang around here, and I'm going to close the kitchen after, and I'll let you know when I open it back up again. And we can
Mhm.
keep it simple. And despite it being simple, it actually can be hard to execute and hold to. I think parents have a really hard time when their kid doesn't eat. We call these the hunger avoider parents. And so I think a bit of it is just setting those loving but firm boundaries.
Yeah, that was very much how it was at my kitchen table growing up. Like it was, this is what mom made for dinner. If you don't want it, you don't eat. And she was like, it was a very strict rule around food. I don't see as many parents being that way anymore, but I almost think there is something in that that really worked because my siblings and I, none of us were picky. It kind of forced us all to try new foods. And I don't know that I would employ exactly that same method, but I think that I agree with you. There is something to be said for saying, like, trying to work with them a little bit, but being like, well, this is what we made for dinner. If you don't want it, that's okay. But this is what's on the menu tonight.
And even sometimes, like in that moment, just saying to your child, like, you know, I see some things here you usually do eat, and because sometimes the child gets so fixated on like what they perceive as the yucky food that they forget the glass of milk is there. But a glass of milk is incredibly nourishing, and it can be so filling. So sometimes even a little bit of that being that insight for your child can be really, really helpful. And all that said, you know, if this is happening again and again and again, then it might be time to seek some support from a professional who can sort of make sure that there isn't, you know, anything mechanical going on, or that sometimes anxiety shows up in really funny ways for kids. And so I think sometimes it's good to not be too worried, but if it's really agitating you, or you're kind of double thinking it, always get some feeding support if you can access it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Something that I've observed is that, and again, like I may be just basing this on the example of my nephews, but I've noticed, like I said at the beginning, they've started to get progressively pickier. And I don't think it is actually that they have started to dislike more foods. I think it's that they've observed that if they reject what's for dinner, they will get something else. And
Mm.
I noticed in one of your posts, you said that about 50% of parents believe their kid to be a picky eater. Do you find that that is very often the case, is that they almost get into like kids learn very quickly that they can like almost negotiate out of what they just don't feel like eating, and if they know they'll get something else, they'll start to lean into that more.
For sure. Yeah. And that's that part where I mentioned like parents, we really want you to be that sturdy leader where, you know, if this is what was for dinner, then that's fine to have a snack later, but I usually tell parents like don't set a bedtime snack contingent on intake. Like if just because your child ate quote unquote poorly, don't offer a snack only in that situation. Maybe just do a snack every day. And that way your child feels safe and secure, knowing that they're not quite ready for this supper, but they're going to get a filling snack later in the day. And that can be like a really nice win-win for parents. All that said, toddlerhood in particular is generally like hallmark, and it's developmentally appropriate for kids to go through a bit of like a picky eating phase. In the science, we call it food neophobia, which is the fear of new food. And we find that it kind of hangs around, but gets a bit better around age 6. So it's like, what are parents doing between age 1 and age 6? Like it really does matter, because you don't want to cycle into food parenting styles and behaviors that like don't resonate with the type of parent you want to be. You know, you maybe you don't want to be forcing your child, or maybe you don't want to be super permissive either. And so finding that happy balance is really important to, you know, really pull you out through those 4, almost 6 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would imagine I've always imagined that like if and when I have kids, I will feed them a very wide variety of food and start that early so they can get used to
Mhm.
different food colors and textures and tastes and stuff. But I have noticed that it's usually sometime between, you know, going from baby to toddler to child, that they almost just kind of like, sometimes it seems like they just choose to start getting pickier, and things that you're like, you've had this dozens of times, all of a sudden they don't like anymore. And going back to my last point about that post of yours where you said a lot of parents perceive their kids to be picky eaters, but then they will often try kind of tactics to reduce the pickiness, but sometimes those tactics actually make it worse. Do you have like, could you share like an example of when you've seen that be the case, or tactics that you've seen people use that actually worsen the pickiness?
Yeah, but I have a really great example actually. I had a case where this child, he was a selective eater, and you know, mom noticed that when she served fish sticks but called them chicken nuggets, he would eat them happily. And he enjoyed chicken nuggets. She said, Nita, you know, what do you think about this? And I was like, man, if he finds out that this is fish, not only do you lose the fish stick, but you're going to lose the chicken nugget. But at the crux of it is is dishonesty, right? And so sometimes as a parent, like you just really want to sneak the food in because you know it's nutritious and you know they'll eat it if you go with this. But what you're risking then is compromising the trust between you and your child, which is super important. And then also losing like more than just one food. And the same is like with sneaking. Like parents love to sneak all sorts of things without disclosure into smoothies and pasta sauce. And listen, I'm all about getting in vegetables and unique ingredients, but I think that it's important to be upfront with your child, especially if they're asking, because like they're never going to learn to like spinach if they don't know they're consuming it. It's just not going to happen. So those are some practices. I think it's like the best of intentions, but they don't work long term. You know, when we're looking at working with a 2 or 3-year-old, I want parents to have like a vision of their future child at 16. And is this going to help support them long term? Another one is also screen and distractions, which is like, I think again, parents are they just want their kid to eat. But sometimes, you know, the reality is when your child does go to school, is in social settings, like there isn't going to be a screen on to help them eat. And so just, you know, asking parents a little bit about the intent and why they're using that as a tactic. And if we really believe it's going to be a good long-term strategy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would assume that a screen would have the opposite effect. Like a screen would almost like deter kids from eating. But you're saying some parents have found that if they put their kid in front of a screen, it actually, I guess, distracts them from eating what they
Yeah.
don't want to eat, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I will note as I've learned more about the children I serve that are neurodivergent is that sometimes a screen can actually be really helpful because it sort of just like helps kind of like calm things down so that they can embrace the meal in front of them. But then, you know, for some children, it can be less of a helpful tool.
Are there like certain kind of signs or symptoms that you could pick up on in a child's eating that would maybe indicate that they could be neurodivergent? I don't know if this is like within your scope, but
Yeah. I certainly wouldn't be able to diagnose, but when I look at my kiddos who are neurodivergent, there are definite tendencies, and often like food is one of the places where sometimes we see some early signs, whether it's like an affinity for a certain texture or certain rituals around meal times, like it has to be a specific spot in this specific room at a specific time, and not being able to be very flexible. Those are all really tricky things that I think parents are navigating for sure with children that perhaps live with ADHD or are on the spectrum.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I mean, I'm sure it probably ranges greatly, but what do you think is maybe the most or one of the most common problems that parents come to you with?
I think it's what we've talked about a lot, which is the picky eating for sure. I am also seeing a little bit more of parents being concerned about their child living in a larger body. And that's always like really difficult to kind of navigate. But it's so great that parents are seeking that support because that's a tough one for sure. But I would say those two are probably the two bigger reasons. A little bit more recently, and I don't know if it's because I'm talking about it more on social media, but also iron deficiency is another area that I feel like I'm focusing a lot on in my private work.
Like you're seeing that come up more with your clients as well.
Totally, yeah. Like adults, but then a ton of children who actually like we're just realizing like you're anemic, and so you're tired and irritable and frustrated, and school performance isn't, you know, where it maybe once was, but it's really because you're missing out on this really critical nutrient.
Interesting. Wow. And do you feel like that has become more prevalent recently?
Yeah, and a part of that is because I'll say it broadly, but in Canada, the guidelines around how iron deficiency is being diagnosed have changed. So more people are getting diagnosed. So depending on like the research that you look at when it comes to toddlers, it's like they're suggesting, you know, 1 out of 3. And then for women, it's 1 in 4. And a large part of that is because women were often menstruating, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. So
Mhm.
when a family comes to you and they want to work together, I assume it probably looks a little bit different on a case by case basis, but do you typically have like a period of time that you work with a family with, or kind of how often you talk with them, or do you actually meet the child? Like, what does that usually look like in terms of your process?
Sure. When we're working with children, it's very rare that I work with the child one-on-one. Most of the work really is on parent coaching and working with the parent. That being said, there are some instances where I have worked one-on-one with a kiddo. Maybe it's related to allergies, or maybe I've got a child who's kind of like on the cusp of being an adult as well. So that's 16, 17-year-old. And typically the process looks like an initial assessment, which is fairly lengthy. It's a 90-minute where I really get to learn a lot about the family food history, the culture, sort of food preferences. And then we usually have an action plan. Parents need a little bit of time to kind of implement that plan. And then I usually set a follow-up for about 5 to 6 weeks later.
Nice. Okay. So kind of give them some time to implement it and then see how the implementation is going.
Yeah.
What's a very big misconception that you found people have about your line of work?
That, I don't eat XYZ food. And usually the XYZ food are your like, highly palatable, non-nutritive foods like a cake or chocolate or chips. That's a really common misconception. But I love food. I love food so much. And I feel really fortunate to have a positive relationship with food. So I think like people maybe assume I avoid all sugars and only count my macros and I'm calorie counting, but I engage in none of that behavior, to be quite frank.
Okay. So you find that people assume that because you work as a dietitian that you follow like an extremely strict diet.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Not at all. Not at all. I'm in it with a lot of parents too, working full time, two busy kids. Like it's just as challenging for me to get food on the table. And so sometimes those more convenient foods, they are a part of my parenting village, and I'm okay with that. It doesn't mean that there's absence of nutritious and healthful foods. And, I really feel for the families where they're unable to kind of adopt that, and it's actually making them sick to obsess about health so much.
Mhm.
That's really tough.
Yeah, yeah, I totally resonate with that. I think parents who, or just people who kind of develop a bit of like a neurotic or obsessive relationship with food and their kids are coming at it from a really good place of like wanting their kids to eat well and get all the nutrients, but it can probably often have the opposite effect on the child
Mhm.
when you are super rigid and restrictive. And yeah, I could totally
Yeah,
see that.
yeah. And I see it play out in adulthood because often these are the folks that need to reform and unlearn a story with food. And so a term that we use is like diet trauma, right? And so that's what that is. And it can take years to unlearn and to relearn more positive behaviors and thoughts around because then when you're an adult, you have money and then you go and you buy all sorts of things and you feel really dysregulated around food, which is so
Mhm.
tough.
Yeah. I know, I mean, this kind of leads well into my next question because I know we've talked about already this, this concept of, good food versus bad food and being super rigid with kids in terms of when they eat. Are there any other things that you very often see parents do that accidentally create a negative relationship with food for their kids?
I mean, I think it could possibly bleed into the child's perception of food. But I think when women, especially mothers, are really highly critical of their body size, that can be so tough on a child because this child just thinks the world of you. And then that sends really confusing messages to them and about how they should perceive their own body. And so I think some of the best preventative medicine out there for children is us actually taking a bit of time to speak more compassionately about our bodies. It's really hard for women to get to a place where they're completely in admiration and love for their body. But I really, really work hard on asking clients, like, can you get to a place where you can achieve some neutrality, where we're just a little bit in the middle and not sitting in a place of a lot of negative self-talk and really hating your body.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That immediately just had me nodding, not even realizing it, because I feel like that was something that I kind of retroactively looked back on in my own kind of healing journey of like, why I became so critical of my body. And I realized it was very reflective of the way that I heard my own mom talk about her body growing up. And the way I kind of think about it now is like, if catch myself even thinking, like looking in the mirror and thinking something about my body that I would never say to another woman about her body, like, picking apart a body part or saying, this is too big or I don't like this about myself. If you wouldn't look at your child or your best friend and say that to them about their body, why are you saying it to yourself
Mhm.
about yours?
Totally. The monologues we have in our head are some of the most important, but can also be the most challenging, but also the most liberating conversations. And so, yeah, I think I do see that a lot I mean, I don't see it in children right now because I'm not in that, but I am seeing it where a lot of millennials grew up with boomer moms who, and I feel for boomer moms because they were inundated with, listen, like Oprah. It was like herbal magic. There was Weight Watchers, Beachbody, Atkins. Like it was like a pretty messed up time. And so I think collectively that generation, in particular, if you lived in a large body, would have been pretty confusing and pretty traumatic.
So how do you help, like, do you ever have parents that come to you and they're concerned that their child maybe is getting too large for their age? How do you help parents kind of decipher that? Because I imagine there probably are some parents that are just being really weary and maybe a little bit too critical. But is that ever something that people kind of come to you with? Like, I'm concerned that my kid is maybe too large for their age?
No, for sure. And I think sometimes the conversation is around, okay, if this is a prepubescent time, like this is actually expected. There is a significant weight gain and growth that takes place during this time. And often we need that weight to support linear growth, which is height. And other times when there is a really rapid acceleration in a short period of time, we might just want to, talk to the family about, well, what's changed? Well, actually, my child used to play soccer 3 days a week, and now they're not really into that. And we've gotten really into gaming, which is exciting and it's something they're passionate about. So just, okay, so maybe there's an opportunity to look at movement, or maybe you have a parent who has now re-entered the workforce after being at home. So there's just more on-the-go meals and convenient food. So I think trying to understand a little bit of the why helps me kind of develop an action plan that's going to be safe. But we never set a goal for weight loss. That's typically contraindicated when you're working in pediatrics. We're looking at setting goals around health promoting behaviors. Is the child getting adequate sleep? What does the snack and meal schedule look like? Are we grazing all day? And those really help to kind of guide the process. Again, going back to why I like to meet with parents, those aren't conversations you want to have in front of a child because it can feel so stigmatizing for them to have their way to be the center of a 90-minute conversation is so tough.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine. But like you said, it's more about kind of healing and optimizing the process and the relationship with food, not necessarily a result or trying to get them to a weight. We want to work on that whole thing at like the process of it, not
Mhm.
the end result necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think sometimes the conversation is with the parent, like understanding like what is actually their perception of thinness and fatness. And, the reality is we do live in a fat phobic society where we pursue things like youth, whiteness, and thinness. And these are, parts of the human experience, but they don't have to be the thing that we strive for. And so I think sometimes just understanding where it's coming from can be really helpful too, because the reality is some people are in small bodies and other people are in larger bodies. And just like neither one food is that good or bad, like neither is good or bad. I know plenty of people who live in thin bodies that have poor health, and the opposite is true as well, that we have people who live in large bodies that are, very healthy and living fruitful lives.
Yeah, you said kind of figuring out where something is stemming from, and it made me think of something that I saw in a couple of your videos where you said that you have a bit of a problem with the term root cause when it comes to talking about health. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some of those cases, it's like we're trying to dig and dig and dig for something. and it may not really be there, or you may actually just really make yourself sick trying to find that root cause. So for example, certain gut disorders, or maybe even acne. That's a really popular one. Someone has a breakout and they're just ready to like eliminate these 10 foods without maybe looking at other opportunities that could help them through that. And so that's kind of what I mean by that. And also right now, autoimmune diseases, or people are talking a lot about cortisol and like need to find this root cause. I think audiences and consumers are turning to folks who actually may not be able to support them properly and aren't properly trained. And it's just important to keep that in mind and seek out professional help from medical professionals, licensed professionals that can support you.
Yeah. And I can imagine when you're working with parents, especially people who are like first-time parents and they have their first baby, I mean, people can get obsessive with their own health and trying to find the root cause. And my skin, my hair, my weight, whatever, we can kind of go down these rabbit holes. But I imagine that gets so much more intensified when you're now looking at your baby or your toddler's health.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if somebody was maybe watching this and they were interested in learning more about working with you, or maybe even just wondering, like, how do I know if a dietitian is the thing that I need? Where would you kind of point them to first?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, folks are more than welcome to find me on my website and we can kind of start that conversation. And so my website is nitasharda.com. And then there are also websites like Dietitians of Canada, and in Manitoba, it's the Manitoba College of Dietitians in Manitoba. And you can learn a little bit more about the scope of practice for dietitians and try to understand if that is an area that you may benefit from. I think a lot of people don't know this, but you may have insurance coverage that, offers you dietitian services. So, it's something that you're likely paying into. And so you can reap those benefits by booking in with a dietitian. And I certainly don't think I'm the right fit for everyone. There's so many more dietitians that are out there practicing in this way. And so kind of just looking around, people can even ask me if there's a particular area of expertise that they need. I could send them to someone, but there's a lot of great dietitians with really niche expertise now. And so we can help to be a part of that feeding journey and help fight any misinformation and support you in having a positive relationship with food.
Nice. And do people, if they wanted to work with a dietitian, do they need to be referred by a doctor, or can they reach out on their own?
So to see a dietitian, you don't need to have a referral in the private sector. However, some insurance policies do require that. So you just have to look into your own insurance provider and see what they're asking for. And I would say most of the physicians that I work with are super supportive when clients want to reach out to a dietitian for that nutrition care. And I'd say a large percentage of the clients I see are on a referral basis from some physicians that I've been really fortunate to have a positive relationship with.
Nice. Okay. That's good to know. I always kind of think like this might be a bit of a stupid question, but I find the stupid questions are always worth asking. Cool. Well, the last question that I always like to ask people when we end the show is, like I said to you before, we kind of make this content for people who feel like inspired idiots, in that they're trying to build the life that they want. They don't really know what they're doing most of the time, but they're like, I'm just gonna figure it out. If you could pass on one piece of advice to people who feel that way, what is the first thing that comes to your mind?
I feel like I use this phrase a lot, even in nutrition context, but it's never too late and it's never too early. I think that's like, it just is succinct and sums it up. It's never too late to want to try something, and it's never too early. And in the same way, when it comes to wanting nutrition support or feeding interventions, like it's never too late and it's never too early.
Just go for it.
Yeah, just go for it.
Nice. Good. That's a good note to end it on. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but I just wanted to say thank you again for coming on and sharing with us, sharing your expertise. I feel like my family members are all waiting to watch this one just to support my nephew. So thank you. This is cool.
You're welcome.
Awesome.